morning. So good to see everyone out this morning. We appreciate you being here. Also, we have some visitors here this morning. We want to say welcome to you. Welcome to the Ashland City Church of Christ, the best place to be on the best day of the week. We're so glad you were here. I think about sometimes in getting to know everyone and getting to know some of the struggles that you're going through. And I know we have families who are grieving, who are facing sicknesses and all kinds of health struggles, and I know that there are worries, and I know that there are fears, and it could be that there are things going on at your job place or at school or at work, and I think about some of these problems and struggles and these different burdens and worries that I know you're facing. And there are probably just a ton more that I'm not even aware about. But I know that all of us, every single one of us, come here, gather here with worries, don't we? We have things that are on our minds. We have things that are on our heart. Things that we don't know necessarily how they're actually going to work out. And we try to kind of push those things aside, and we try not to think about them, but sometimes those kind of things can just get absolutely overwhelming, can't they? And so I was thinking about this idea, and we've spent a lot of time already this year thinking about this idea of loyalty, this idea of faith. And just imagine this scenario, if you will. Just kind of try to picture it. And it may be something that's actually happened to you with someone else. But what if I told you, here you come to me and you share your burden with me, and you say, I'm worried about this, I'm a little scared about this, or I'm struggling with something, and you say, this is what's on my mind. And this is what's on my heart. And I just look you right in the eye, and I just say, well, have faith. I wonder if you would stop and think about what I meant by that. If someone just said, you lay your heart out, and someone just tells you, well, just have faith. I would dare say that some of you would probably maybe even roll your eyes at that. And in all honesty, I wouldn't blame you one bit if you did. Because this is how we tend to think about the word faith. And what we think that means when someone just says, well, have faith. And here we are, we're really worried about something. And we think, well, I don't know how this is going to go. And I don't know how this is going to work out. And I'm just overwhelmed by this. And we're sharing this. And someone looks at us and says, well, just have faith. I think sometimes we think that it means this idea of just sitting back and just doing nothing, and just trusting God, that God is going to fix this problem. A lot of times when we hear that, especially in that context, that's where our mind goes. But what I'm hoping over the last few weeks, and in the coming weeks, and the months, and throughout this year, I hope what we're learning is that faith is so much more than that. Now, there's some truth to that. But we tend to think about faith and having faith as something that's just very, very passive, don't we? We think about faith as something that we just do passively. But faith has to be lived out. And I hope that that's what we're seeing over the last few weeks as we've looked at this. And I hope that's what we continue to see as we think about faith as this picture of loyalty. And I hope that we'll realize the fact that our faith has to be lived out. And that's why, again, it's helpful to think of faith as an allegiance, as a loyalty, because if someone comes up to you and says, hey, be loyal, if someone says, give God your allegiance, then you would realize, hey, this is something that has to be done actively, not passively. It's not just something that you do passively. So when we say have faith, When we say, hey, be like these people in Hebrews 11, these people of faith, we're saying more than just sit back and don't do anything and trust that God is going to fix the situation. It's so much more than that. We're saying our faith has to be lived out. And you might think of it, we could think of it all kind of like as a story. And being a person of faith is being someone who is convinced, is absolutely convinced that the story of the world and our story is God's story. And so it's this commitment that I'm going to live out the story of God. I'm going to live out the story of the gospel. I'm going to live out this story, and I'm going to live into that story, because that story not only tells me where I've been, not only tells me where I am, but also tells us where we are headed. And there are a lot of stories in the world. There are a lot of stories in the world by which we could live, but being a person of faith is living according to the gospel story. But here's the thing about faith. The thing about Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Joseph and all of these people that we've been talking about over the last few weeks, when we are people of faith, when we live out our faith, when we live loyally to God, it does not make sense to people who don't live by that same story. In fact, it seems absolutely ridiculous to them. But faith is being someone like Abraham or Isaac or Jacob and saying, I'm going to live wherever you tell me to live, God. I'm going to go wherever you send me. I'm going to live as a stranger, and I will live as a foreigner, and I'll live as an exile. I'll live as a sojourner. I'll live in tents, Lord, because I'm going to live out this story that you've told me that I'm a part of. It's being like Abraham and saying to God, I will sacrifice whatever it is that you tell me to sacrifice, Lord, even if it's something that I love more than life itself. I will sacrifice whatever it is you tell me to sacrifice, because I know that this story is going to end the way you say it's going to end. It's like Moses in saying, I will suffer mistreatment with your people rather than enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. I'm going to live according to your story, even if living according to your story seems ridiculous to everyone that's around me. That's what it means when we encourage one another and tell one another, have faith. Have faith. We're saying, be loyal to Him. Live according to this story. Even on the days where it really doesn't make sense. Even on the days when it doesn't look like it's going to work out. At least the way we think it's going to work out. Even on the days when it hurts. And even on the days when it's scary. And even when you realize, hey, you've already messed up and you've already fallen short. When we say have faith, we mean live according to this story no matter what. So we're going to pick up where we left off last week, Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 30, and we're finishing out this chapter. We're finishing out this series, and here's this interesting story in verse 30. And so here the people of Israel, the Hebrew people, they're coming back into the promised land. The first city they come to, the first city they have to conquer is Jericho. And you may be familiar with this story, you may not be. But they come to the city of Jericho, and it's this big city. It's a big walled city. Most of the ancient cities, they just had these huge walls back then. And they're supposed to conquer this city. And so here's this group of freed slaves. They have nothing. They don't have any city of their own. And they're supposed to come up and conquer this walled city. And anybody remember what they were supposed to do? No Bible coloring books when you were kids?
I did.
What were they supposed to do?
They're supposed to walk around the city once a day, quietly, for 7 days, and on the last day, after they get around it, to let out a yell, or they're supposed to yell all the way around it the last day. I can't remember that.
Yell around the last day 7 times on that last day, right? They're to march around it. 7 days. They're supposed to march around these walls. But here's what the Hebrew writer says in verse 30. He tells us by faith, the walls of Jericho fell down after they had been encircled for 7 days. By what did they fall down? By faith. By faith. By faith. As opposed to what? As opposed to military strength? There wasn't any of that. They didn't fall by military strength. They didn't fall by strategy. They didn't even fall by the goodness of the people because the people were so good. The walls just came down. No, they came down because the people had faith. But what did that faith look like? What did that faith do? By faith, the walls of Jericho fell down after they had been encircled for 7 days. They had to do what God said to do. They had to live out the story that God gave to them, even though it seemed ridiculous, didn't it? But here's how it's going to work. You're going to walk around this city for 7 days, and then the walls are going to come down. I mean, can you imagine what they felt like just day after day after day? How silly that must have seemed to most of them. But yet they did it because they were being loyal to God. One simple act of loyalty to Him. And again, there's so much application here for us. And there's so much, because when you think of things like the Sermon on the Mount, I think of the Sermon on the Mount a whole lot. And I don't know if you do, but in thinking about Moses and the law that God gave to the people of Israel and the way they were supposed to live and how very different that would make them from the people around them, it's very similar to this sermon that Jesus gave to His people to say, hey, this is the way you're supposed to live as my followers, as my disciples. But living that way and loving your enemies and turning the other cheek and considering yourself blessed when you're persecuting, going so far to avoid sin that you would pretty much cut off your eye or cut off your hand to avoid that, to avoid living that way, that seems ridiculous, doesn't it? Why would we live like the Sermon on the Mount? Because we trust that Jesus' story is the truth. We're living as people of faith, even though it seems silly and ridiculous, just as ridiculous as marching around a city 7 times for 7 days, thinking that's going to actually bring the walls down. When we live out the Sermon on the Mount, when we live out the teachings of Jesus, that's what it is to have faith, to trust God. It's not just sitting back and doing nothing and just assume that God's going to fix this particular problem. Honestly, I don't know what's going to happen with this particular problem, but I do know that if we live loyally, if we give Jesus our allegiance, if we live out His story, then I know we're going to live forever. And we're going to be blessed now, and you're going to be blessed forever according to His story. Look at verse 31. He continues and he says, by faith Rahab the prostitute did not perish with those who were disobedient because she had given a friendly welcome to the spies. Every time I read that name, I always think to myself, you know, in the resurrection, I wonder what Rahab is actually thinking when everybody refers to her everywhere in Scripture as that. But isn't it interesting that here the Hebrew writer, he's telling people who are even familiar with this story, he reminds us of the kind of woman that she was. Because the people of faith weren't just the people marching around the city. There was a person of faith inside the city. There's a Gentile person, a Gentile woman, a Gentile prostitute, and she was a person of faith. She had heard about Yahweh. She had heard about the God of these Hebrew people, and she said, hey, this God is not like our gods. This God, the God of the Hebrew people, He's not like the God of my people. He's not like the gods of the Canaanites. This God is going to be the God who rules and reigns here. And this God is going to give my place to these people. And so here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to give my loyalty to this God. Now, what does it make somebody? What does that make somebody when they say, I'm going to throw in my lot with the people who are attacking us? Makes them a traitor, doesn't it? She's a traitor to her people. And she was willing to be a traitor to her people, to give her allegiance to the God of this people who were about to march on her city, to welcome the spies who had come there to spy out the city. She protected them. Why? Because she knew that there was something special about their God. And so that simple act of allegiance, that simple act of loyalty meant that she was on God's side. It didn't matter where she had been. It didn't matter what she had done. It didn't matter who she had been with. It didn't matter what people group she belonged to. What mattered to God was that she gave him her loyalty. And when she threw her lot in with the Hebrew people, with the Israelite people, and with their God and said, I trust your God, not the gods of my people, not the gods of the city, not the gods I grew up with. I'm going to give my loyalty and allegiance to your God. That simple act of loyalty and allegiance put her into the story of Israel. In fact, so much so that she would become one of the ancestors of Jesus. She was grafted into this family. She was grafted into this story. Why? Because she gave her loyalty, her allegiance, her faith to this God. Didn't mean that she sat back and just said, okay, I'm just going to sit here and do nothing. No, she did something. This simple act of loyalty, simple act of allegiance. It was more important than what she had done or who she had been with or what people she belonged to. This simple act of loyalty and allegiance put her into the story of God. Look at verse 32. And what more shall I say? For time would fail me to tell of Gideon and Barak and Samson and Jephthah and David and Samuel and the prophets. Now, you may recognize some of these names. Some of these names you may not recognize. But I'll be honest with you, when I look at this list, I kind of struggle as to why they're here. I mean, so far we've studied about people like Noah and Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Moses. Those names, they make perfect sense. But then we get here and we get to Gideon. I think, Gideon, really? I mean, this is the Hall of Faith chapter, and here we are, Gideon. You go back to the book of Judges, you read about Gideon. I mean, Gideon was this guy. He doubted, and he doubted, and he doubted, and he doubted. And then he would trust, and then he'd make a bunch more mistakes after that. I mean, this isn't the person you would look at and say, hey, he's a good person. I mean, you would look at him and say, he's flawed. He's a very flawed person. And then Barak, he was a judge who was so hesitant when it was time to go to war, so scared. He was just faltering, and he didn't want to go. Then you think of Samson. Samson, I know we like the story of Samson. They're exciting. They're captivating, especially to the youngers. But when we look at the story of Samson, is that really someone you would want to follow in his example? I mean, Samson was extremely deceitful. He was a womanizer. He had a temper and was violent. I mean, is this the kind of person? Do we think we would say, hey, that's a really good person. And we look at all of these men and we see these people are flawed people. These are sinful people. These are broken people. Jephthah? I mean, he made probably one of the worst decisions in the entirety of the Bible. He said, God, if you give me this victory, I'm going to sacrifice to you whatever comes out of my house. And, oh, whoops, there's his daughter. That guy? Really? That guy? But in actuality, the more we think about this list, the more I hope that we realize that we're really thankful that these people made the list because, yes, they're flawed. Rahab was flawed. Barak was flawed. Gideon was flawed. Samson was flawed. Jephthah was flawed. They were sinful people. But they also had moments where they gave God their loyalty and their allegiance. Moments where they said, I know the odds are stacked against me. I know it doesn't make sense. I know it seems just absolutely ridiculous, but I'm going to trust in you. And I'm going to throw my lot in with you, God. I'm going to live according to your story. And those simple acts of loyalty, those simple acts of allegiance, by living according to God's story, because of that, they were able to experience salvation and victory and deliverance. Because they were good? No. Because they were smart? No. Because they were some sort of biblical scholars, or they had this long laundry list of all these great deeds they had done? No. Because of their piety? Their religious nature? No. Because they had faith. And again, faith is not something where you just sit back and do nothing. Faith is not something that just says, well, I guess God's going to fix this. No. It's a faith that says, I'm going to live according to your story. And I'm going to go where you tell me to go. And I'm going to do what you tell me to do. And I'm going to live like you tell me to live. And I'm going to live according to your story. And it doesn't matter what I've done. It doesn't matter where I've been. It doesn't matter how far short I've fallen. I'm going to live out your story. I'm going to live according to that. And those simple acts of loyalty, they go rewarded with deliverance and salvation. And it doesn't mean that they earned God's salvation or God's favor. They trusted that God was going to give them deliverance, and because of that trust, they acted accordingly. They lived accordingly. They lived with loyalty. And so I hope we read this list of names together, and we think, regardless of what happened yesterday, and regardless of who you were yesterday, and regardless of what you did yesterday, because maybe there's this voice in your head. Maybe there's this voice in your head that tells you, you've already blown it. You've already fallen short. You've doubted, and you've strayed, and you've sinned, and you think because of that all disqualifies you. But these names remind us, regardless of what we did yesterday, regardless of whether or not we've doubted yesterday, regardless of whether or not we fell short yesterday, to be faithful now, to be loyal now, to give God our allegiance now. And that's what the Hebrew writer is encouraging people to do, to hold on, to hold on. And it's so tempting. I know it's so tempting just to give up. And I know it's tempting to walk away. And I know it's tempting to live according to a different story. But regardless of where you've been, regardless of what you've done, regardless of the mistakes that you've made, live faithfully now. Choose today to live trusting God and trusting His story. Look at verse 33. It says, these people who through faith conquered kingdoms, enforced justice, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the power of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, were made strong out of weakness, and became mighty in war, put foreign armies to flight, women received back their dead by resurrection. They experienced the salvation, the deliverance, the victory of God, not through strength, not by power, not by strategy, not by wealth, but through what? Through faith. These simple acts of loyalty. To say, I'm going to do it your way, God. Even when it doesn't make sense, I'm going to do it your way. Even when it seems ridiculous, I'm going to do it your way. Even when the odds are stacked against me, I'm going to do it your way. And when they did, they experienced the salvation and the deliverance and the victory of God. We don't experience deliverance and salvation simply by sitting back and doing nothing. And saying, I guess God's going to fix this. We experience it by living according to the story that He's given us. But even these things were just a glimpse of salvation in reality, weren't they? It was just a foretaste of salvation, just a sneak peek, just a preview of salvation, because all of these people still died. They still were buried. They still got diseases, and they still got old, and they still felt pain. And in fact, some of them suffered far worse. When we continue reading in verse 35, he says, some were tortured, refusing to accept release so that they might rise again to a better life. Others suffered mocking and flogging and even chains and imprisonment. They were stoned. I mean, this is painful to read, isn't it? They were stoned. They were sawn in two. They with a sword. They went about in skins of sheep and goats, destitute, afflicted, mistreated. Now remember why the Hebrew writer is preaching this sermon. Because there's so many Christians that were on the brink of just giving up because people, they're not being nice to them anymore. Because they've fallen out of favor with their family and friends, because they're suffering shame, and that's hard. But he reminds them, this is what your ancestors suffered. This is what they went through, and they suffered, and they suffered, they suffered, they suffered, they suffered. Why? Because they were being faithful to Yahweh. They were giving their loyalty to the Lord. They were following His story, and they were willing, because they were living out that story, because they were living out their faith, they were willing to suffer torture and mocking and flogging and chains and imprisonment and being stoned and sawn in two, being killed with a sword. Why? Because they trusted that the story was going to end the way God said it was going to end. I mean, can you imagine? Even in the moment where stones were being thrown at them, even in the moment when the sword was being sharpened, even when the whip was crossing their backs, they trusted that somehow this story is going to end the way God said it's going to end. Look at verse 38. Of whom the world was not worthy, wandering about in deserts and in mountains and in dens and in caves of the earth. This is what loyalty looks like. And this is the sort of loyalty and allegiance they're being called to, that we're being called to. The sort of loyalty and allegiance that we can all live out. We don't have to be Bible scholars. We don't have to have this long list of these great religious deeds of what we've done. It doesn't matter what we've done or where we've been. It doesn't matter what you've done. It doesn't matter who you've been with. What matters is that you start doing now. Will you start going forward now? Because this story is a story for people like Rahab, people like Gideon, people like Barak, people like Jephthah, people like Samson. They get to be a part of this story. People like the Israelites who marched around Jericho. What matters is, will you trust Him now? Will you throw your lot in with God and with His people and say, I'm going to live according to this story, even if that means I have to suffer like those who came before me suffered? Look at verse 39. And all these, though commended through their faith, did not receive what was promised. All these, though commended through their faith, did not receive what was promised. Since God had provided something better for us, that apart from us, they should not be made perfect. There's no promise that victory, that deliverance, that salvation is going to happen in a particular lifetime. So the result? Some of them were destitute, and they were afflicted. They were persecuted. They were mocked their entire lives. And none of the people that we've looked at these past few weeks, none of the people mentioned here, none of them received all of the promises of God. They were still waiting. What were they waiting for? The writer here says they were waiting for something better. And that's what the rest of the book of Hebrews That's where the rest of the book of Hebrews comes in. Who's the better? What's the better? The better is Jesus. The better is the promises that we have because of Jesus. Because Jesus has come, we've received that better king. We've received that better high priest. We have the better prophet, the one that the prophets have said was coming. He is the better one. He is the better sacrifice. And they were all waiting for him so that together, us them in the first century, with us in the 21st century, and those who came before us, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, Moses, David, Jephthah, Rahab, all of us together will be raised to live forever. And we'll all enter into the new Jerusalem together. Together. And he says, all of them, they waited, and they waited, and they waited, and they waited for what now has been revealed to us. Jesus is the better one. But there's still waiting that we have to do, isn't there? Even though that better promise has been revealed to us, we're living in the last days, and we've been living in the last days since Jesus walked out of the tomb. And we've seen the last chapter of the book, and we're living in it, but we're still waiting. But we have all of these brothers and sisters who came before us to show us how the wait is worth it all. To show us how to live by faith. That living by faith isn't passively just doing nothing and expecting that God's just going to fix the problem. Living by faith is saying, I'm going to live according to your story. And know that when this story is over, we will experience far better than we could have ever asked for. We could have ever imagined. And the good news is we don't have to be flawless. We just have to be faithful. To experience the salvation, the deliverance, the victory that God has promised to us, that God has to offer his people, we don't have to be flawless. We just have to be faithful. And that's good news, isn't it? That this victory is for people like you. This victory is for people like me. When I think about all the things that I've done, how far I've fallen short, sometimes Satan would love to just trick me into thinking, you've already blown it, Mike. You've already messed up too bad. You've doubted too much. You've strayed too far. You've fallen too short. But then I'm reminded that we're saved not by works, but we're saved by grace through the medium of faith. And that this is a gift of God so that no one is able to boast. But that faith by which we are saved is not passive, where we just sit back and do nothing. No. It requires us to live out this loyalty to God, to live loyally to him, remembering all the while that our faithfulness begins and ends with Jesus, not us. Our faithfulness begins and ends with Jesus, not us. Now, he'll say in the next chapter, in chapter 12, that he is the author and the perfecter of our faith, to keep our eyes on Jesus. Keep our eyes on Jesus. Our faith and our salvation begins and ends with him. We follow him into the baptistry, don't we? We follow him into the water, dying to ourselves, dying to our old life, dying to our old story, and saying, I'm not going to live that story out anymore. I want a new story. Being buried with him, being united with him, and then being raised up to live out, to walk out this new life by faith, trusting that his story is the right story, the true story, the story that ends well. And some of you, maybe you haven't made the decision yet, but it's time. It's time to pledge your allegiance and your loyalty to King Jesus. To say, wherever you call me to go, I'll go. Whatever you call me to do, I'll do. However you call me to live, I will live. I won't be flawless. I won't be perfect, but I will be faithful. And if you haven't been baptized into Jesus, let me encourage you. Take the step today. Or maybe you've made that decision. Maybe you feel like maybe you strayed away from that. You need to recommit your life to Jesus. And that's the beauty of this story that we're all a part of, that at any point that you realize, hey, wait a minute, I'm not living out this story. I need to come home. Your Heavenly Father is waiting there for you with open arms, with grace and mercy and love to say, come home. Whatever you've done in the past, what matters is, will you live by faith now? Will you live loyally now? Or maybe you're just struggling. Maybe you're just hurting. Maybe you're carrying around this heavy burden that's weighing you down, and you just need your brothers and sisters in Christ to surround you with love and with prayers. There's nothing more than we would love to do right now. Together we stand and sing.